Welcome to the third general meeting of the semester, 10th general meeting for the academic year. Today we're going to be breaking down the GRE.
Cool. And then just a small disclaimer. So all of like the recommendations in here are just that, recommendations. The resources and stuff are mostly going to be based on my experience. So other than that, we should be good.
This is me?
Yep.
Okay. So what is the GRE? It's the graduate record examinations. There's 3 parts, 6 sections, total of 3 hours and 45 minutes. You're going to have verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and analytical writing. Each one's going to have their own skills that you're going to test just to help you or to see if you're ready for graduate school.
Yep. So it's basically like the SAT of grad school for those who aren't familiar with it. In terms of like the order, so you get the writing part first, so that's the essays first, and then you have staggered verbal or quantitative reasoning sections. And there's actually one section that's experimental. So you get 5 sections of the multiple choice. You could either get verbal, quant, verbal, quant, verbal, or quant, verbal, quant, if that makes sense. But the thing is, you don't know which one is experimental, so you just have to treat all of them like the actual tests. Usually you can tell because it's going to be way more difficult feeling, at least. And this is you, Nathan.
Okay, so which schools require the GRE? As you can see, it's quite a few Cal States, from Fresno to Northridge, Long Beach, and Sacramento. San Diego State also, St. Augustine, Chapman, Azusa, Loma Linda, West Coast, St. Mary's, and University of the Pacific in Stockton. The ones that don't include UC San Francisco and San Francisco State. I guess those might be the same, or at least it's optional for San Francisco State. Same for USC as well, and then not required for Sam Merritt or Western University.
Yeah, so you can see most of the public schools require it. The UCSF/SFSU joint program says that it's optional, but they also state on their website that a good score may help your application. If you do have it, obviously a bad one won't count against you because you don't need to actually submit that. So yeah, this is all the California schools, by the way. And if you're planning on applying here, I would probably recommend taking the GRE, but you don't have to. Or if you get a really bad score, you can just apply to the schools that don't need it. And then this is also you, Nathan.
Okay. So how is the GRE scored? It is a combined score out of 330. Your verbal reason is going to be between 130 and 170. Quantitative reason is going to be the same. And then a separate analytical writing assessment from 0 to 6 with a half-point scaling. You should aim for a minimum of 300 combined scored, or about 150 in each section, and the 50th percentile of each section. And then a 4 or greater for the analytical writing. Yeah,
so just corrections out of 340, it's written on there though. And then in terms of the minimums for most programs, I put them in the order of easiest to achieve to the hardest to achieve, because a 50th percentile doesn't necessarily mean a score of 150 in that area. But I think for most schools, you should be good if you get at least 150 in each section. At least a 4.0 is usually recommended. I know Cal State Long Beach recommends at least a 4.0 on the writing. And in general, just make sure that you check the specific schools that you're aiming for to see what their target scores are. But above all else, focus on your GPA first before the GRE. And Nathan, this is you.
Okay, so when should you take the GRE? No more than one, if you're applying to PT school, no more than 1 month before the PT CAS deadline. That's going to vary by whichever schools you're going to apply to. If you have more free time available to study, like during a gap year or during one of the vacation breaks, you can go ahead and take that time to study. And also leave enough time between test retakes or test taking for a potential retake and restudying before you apply to your program. It is about once every 21 days and up to 5 times in a single year. And scores will usually expire after 5 years.
Yeah, so that's why, like on the last point, that's why it's important to kind of know where you're at in terms of your application cycle so you can plan for that. If you're on a traditional like 4-year undergrad and then applying after that, I would probably recommend taking the GRE after your second or third year. A lot of people even take it after graduation. As long as you can get it done before even the application cycle begins, I think that would be a big benefit to you. But technically, if you are running a little later, like the first bullet point says, which is from the Cal State Long Beach DPT website, you can technically submit it while your application is in progress for some schools. But I would just recommend you to basically complete everything before you apply, obviously. And then again, this is why it's important to check school deadlines, because the deadlines on PTCAS for some schools might be in October, others might be even in February of the next year. And yeah, see.
Okay, so when should you retake the GRE? Probably not unless your score is like really low, especially in regards to what schools you're applying to are looking for, and if it's not going to hinder your application for graduate school, maybe you can focus more on those aspects before you try to retake it. Maybe just prioritize your GPA.
Yeah, so basically, the GRE is really expensive, even with the waiver. So that's why I don't really recommend spending a lot of energy on it if you don't have to. So maybe you could focus on the other parts, such as like extracurriculars, like you could diversify your hours more, take on more leadership positions, even retake some classes that you might not have done well in. And also, since a lot of schools are starting to do away with the GRE, then maybe the weighting on it could be even less than it was before.
So, okay. Okay.
If you're busy, I can cover this one for you.
Sorry, I had to get back on track. Okay.
You're good.
So how do you register for this for the GRE? You can have it proctored at home or at a test center. Either way, I think it's going to be on a computer. The registration fee is going to be $205. You can apply for a 50% fee reduction if you're receiving financial aid, if you're unemployed, or enrolled in something like a scholarship or a scholar type program like Mark U Star, Rise. I think Build also counts, right?
I think it should. Yeah, you just have to look on their website for it, honestly.
Okay, and make sure you allow for 2 weeks of processing time. And you can receive a waiver for retake within 1 calendar year.
Yeah, so personally, I'd recommend taking it at a test center just because I've heard a lot of horror stories with like technical difficulties at home. But if you are someone who has a lot of test anxiety, then maybe consider that you might be more comfortable taking it at home. So it's just up to you. And yeah, and if you're at Long Beach, Mark U Star and Rise are here, I think. So they're research programs along with Build. You might be able to qualify for a waiver if you're in one of those as well.
Okay, so to make a study plan, well, you might want to consider a few things like how much time you have already. So if you're working, if you're the schooling that you already have, volunteering, or anything else that you have, and also how far you are from applying to your graduate program. That can be, I guess, your starting point. And also, it depends on how independent you are on studying. The GRE is run by ETS, I think, and they have their study book. That one has some practice questions and sample questions, or you can find them online, whether through a study plan or through a study course. And there's also live prep classes. And of course, what's your budget? Are you the book's only $40, but if you can afford maybe more preparation, you can look into that. But there's also free things, free example questions. Do they release previous years or previous test examples?
Yeah, like I'll actually get into that in the resources section. So it's a good point.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, so it really just depends on what type of learner you are, because I've talked to some people and I know that they work better with like a lot of structure and guidance. So that's where a prep class might be helpful for you. But there are high quality, free or low budget materials out there online if you do want to study. And generally, I'd probably recommend studying like maybe more than a month. A 1 month program might be kind of intensive, but definitely, I don't think that the GRE is something that you need to study for like half a year, you know, like pedal to the metal, just like 6 hours a day type of thing. I'd say maybe like 1 to 3 months would be my recommendation. And then now we'll just get into all the resources and maybe give you a little preview of what the sections look like and some study tips that worked well for me. So first, I want to go over the ETS Resources. ETS is the company that actually makes the GRE and like administers it. So I usually recommend just using their resources that you can find for free online. All of these you can find for free online. And they're going to be closest to the test because they are made by the test company. So first we have the Power Prep practice test. So they're basically full-length practice tests that you can find online. I would use these as a benchmark. So at the beginning, like near the beginning of your studying, I'd take the first one, see where you are and learn what you're weak in and what to work on, and then take the second one later on. But they have more. Those you just have to purchase. So this is for someone who's only looking to stick to the free tests. And also there's something called the Super Power Pack. So this is a combination of 3 study books, all made by ETS. They have practice tests in the practice questions of varying difficulty, because there are questions of varying difficulty on the GRE, explanations, all that good stuff. And you can find this for free on LibGen. I'll link it later in a document that I'll email out to you guys with all of the resources that I put in here. And so they have a separate math book for the quantitative reasoning and a reading book, basically, which is the verbal reasoning and the overall guide. So it's a really good pack. And then I would supplement that with the GRE Big Book, which is, I think it's like a 27 old full-length tests on the GRE if you do need more practice. And then I think for this one, there are some questions that are a little outdated, but overall people still recommend it as a pretty solid like study material. You guys can just kind of search up online for more details on that one. But let's see, this one also has questions of varying difficulties as well, because it's a bunch of old tests. And then what about any other resources outside of the official ETS resources that I mentioned earlier? So Cal State Long Beach, the grad department, I forgot what it's called, Graduate Resources Center. I think they do offer a free workshop series, which is like 6 sessions of 3-hour-long like Zoom live sessions where they'll go over the GRE. And the next one is in June. I think they usually have one every semester or like one every season, I guess. And this will be linked later on in the email as well. And then there's something called Magoosh that you guys might have heard of. I personally didn't use the Magoosh course, but I have friends who liked it. What I used Magoosh for was the vocabulary, and I'll show you guys what it looks like later. Manhattan is also a pretty solid company. They do have free online videos or like free 1-hour classes that you can sign up for. And they do have another resources that I'll mention later as well. The main resource that I used, or like instructor, if you will, is GregMat. So GregMat is basically a person who has a whole website where he goes over each part of the GRE. He does a lot of like live review sessions if you want to pay for those. It's like $5 a month to access everything, but he has a lot of free videos as well. Just really well-rounded. And he also has study plans set out using all of the free resources. So that's why I liked him, because I was really cheap and he had study plans for me to follow. But overall, oh yeah, and then in terms of Kaplan and Princeton, I've heard mixed things on those. I can't give you any personal experience with them, but I just know like the more you stick to the official test materials, the better off you'll be, is the general consensus. But yeah, overall, I just definitely recommend taking a look at the resources that I put up earlier, which are made by the test company. And then if you need like a community of people to talk to or post questions to, there's the GRE subreddit, as well as a forum on the GRE Prep Club. And then let's get into the first section that you'll be testing on, which is the writing part, so the essays. So basically you have 2 essays, you get 30 minutes to write each of them, and they're all gonna be from these 2 prompts or like styles, I guess. So the first one is the issue essay. The issue essay is basically like a persuasive essay, and I'll show you guys some example prompts. And then there's also an argument essay, which is what I would call like a logic type of essay, and you'll see what I mean. But anyways, my favorite resource for the essays was basically all I did was watch Greg Matt's step-by-step videos where he lays out like how you should structure your formatting for each essay. And then I think I didn't actually do too much practice with the essays, but something that I would recommend is to practice at least making outlines for it. So there's something called the pool of topics, which is on the ETS official website, and it'll actually show you every single prompt that you might get for the GRE. And so you can kind of just go in there, pick a few out and like practice making outlines for them so you can get in the mindset of how to structure your essays. And then also there's something called the Score It Now online writing practice. So it's just a service sold by the ETS company that allows you to use their automated e-grader to score certain practice essays with like prompts written by ETS graders. So basically when you take the GRE, when they grade your essay, it actually goes through like a computer grader first, or well, it goes through a computer grader and you have a person grading it. But the computer grader and person grading it, their grading is usually pretty similar. I think they take the average of the two. So people have said, I didn't use this because it's paid, it's like $20, but it gives you about 6 essays or so that you can grade, which is nice. And people say it's pretty accurate. And then in terms of smaller tips on the essay, when you are taking the exam, the general consensus is that like longer essays kind of get higher scores. And this might be because of like a computer grading it, but it's just like kind of how it is. So I would aim for 500 plus words, but don't worry too much about that. And then generally it's easy to just try to pick 3 main points as you would with normal essays. Also to get higher scores with the computer grading, really try to vary your writing and structure and vocabulary, and definitely check your spelling and grammar because those would be easy points to gain. And then, also, earlier I mentioned the full practice test by ETS called the Power Prep test and how there are more that you can pay for. I think if you do pay for the other ones, you get the e-grader for free with it. So you can look into that as well. So this is just some examples that I pulled from the pool of, from the pool of prompts. So the first one is the issue essay. And this is what I mean by like, it's kind of like a persuasive essay. Most of the prompts are kind of like this. Basically, it's just asking you if you agree or disagree. Why do you agree? How do you support it? Maybe some counterpoints. So that one is a pretty simple, like straightforward, just pick your main points and then, take the other side a little bit and just write an essay basically. And then there's the argument essay, which is a little different. So usually the argument essay, they'll give you some background on the prompt. So in this case, it's a 10-year budget planning committee for a city, right? And then they give you what they're saying, which is that the birth rate's declining. So because the birth rate's declining, there'll be less students in school, so they can put their money towards other things. And then the prompt tells you to discuss what specific evidence is needed. And all the prompts will vary slightly, but I think they're all usually kind of like this for the argument essay when I looked over the pool. So basically, in this case, what I would do is like just pull out the points that they're saying. Like first point is students enrolled will decrease because the birth rate is decreasing. And then you could kind of argue in your essay, does the birth rate decreasing really mean that student enrollment in schools will decrease? And then you kind of go into like, maybe they need to do more studies or surveys, things like that. But if you guys kind of get the idea for this one, what you're doing is just pulling out the points from the essay and analyzing them from a logical perspective. And then in general, for these, since you have 30 minutes to write each, I would recommend spending max like 5 minutes making an outline for them at the beginning. And then after that, just keep going. And again, make sure you remember the points, like vary your language. And at the end, make sure you have at least a little bit of time to kind of check over, all of your grammar and stuff like that. So if anyone has any questions at any time, feel free to drop them in the chat as well. And then next up, we have the verbal part, AKA the English part. So you're gonna have 2 sections that are graded. or that count for your tests, 20 questions and 30 minutes each. And then, like I said earlier, there's always going to be questions of varying difficulty. Also, the GRE is a little weird in that it's like an adaptive test. So that means that depending on how well you do in your first section, the next session might be harder, easier, or the same difficulty. So the grading isn't like a straight out of 20 scale either. I think it depends on how hard the questions are as well. But yeah, you guys can Google that if you're more interested. But anyways, there's three main types of questions that you'll see in the verbal reasoning, which are comprehension, text completion, and sentence equivalence. And I'll show you some examples too. But first off, my main recommendation for studying for the verbal is definitely get your vocab down. So I'd recommend using the Magoosh GRE vocab flashcards, and this is completely free. And it's pretty cool. It's kind of like Quizlet. So you guys can Google it. You can practice them on your desktop or have them on your phone as well, which is really useful. There's like 1,000 words on there, which is a lot. And obviously, like in a perfect world, you would remember or get through all 1,000 words, but I would at least recommend going through the common decks and the basic decks, and you'll see what I mean on the next slide. And then in terms of like strategy and learning, I use GregMat for some of them. But I think just personally, I don't have too much trouble with like English stuff, so I didn't need to work too hard with this. But I would recommend looking at Greg Mack's walkthroughs where he kind of answers GRE questions, and his strategy guides as well, because he has some helpful strategies. And then these are the main strategies that I would recommend for text completion and sentence equivalence. So I'll show you guys first what the Magoosh app looks like. So you can kind of see there's like a bunch of different decks, and you just go through them. It's really cool because it shows, or it keeps track what you missed and what you need to continue mastering. And then it's kind of like a automated spaced repetition type of app. So yeah, I think it really helped me out. And I think a good amount of the words did show up on the actual GRE from this, but super convenient as well. So here's an example of what a text completion sentence might, or question might look like. And then pretty much all of them are structured this way in those three subcategories that I mentioned. So you get a couple blanks, might be 2, might be 3 sometimes, and you get a word bank basically to choose from. And then you just choose whatever fits best. Sometimes it's a phrase as well. So it just depends. And then in terms of sentence equivalence, this one, they always give you 6 options, and they give you a fill in the blank. And then you need to choose 2 words that first like kind of have similar meaning, so synonyms basically. And then those words also have to fit in the blank. So for the first, for the text completion question, usually actually both of these you need to have a good vocab background in. And by the way, these examples that I chose would probably count as like the easier questions. So just keep that in mind. But both of these, it's good to have a background in vocab because that'll help you out a lot. And then you can use process of elimination as well, especially for the first example. And then for the second example, the main strategy that I would recommend is called pairing. So basically you look at all the answer options and then you decide which ones pair up with each other and mean the same thing. So in this case, let's see. So original and innovative kind of are synonyms or similar in meaning. So you can pair that up. Orthodox and conventional are kind of similar. So you can pair those up. And then between the two, you just choose which pair fits better. And that's a strategy that I think was really useful. And then I didn't show reading comprehension because it's kind of basic. It's what you're used to. They give you a long passage. You just answer some questions about the passage. Sometimes you choose one answer. Sometimes you choose multiple answers. And then also sometimes because the GRE is taken on a computer screen, they make you choose like a sentence, that you highlight a sentence within the passage that fits the answer. And so let's move on to quantitative. So quantitative, you get a little bit more time for. You get 35 minutes instead of 30. And then there's still questions of varying difficulty, and there's 4 main question types. But on the GRE, you actually don't need to know calculus. You don't even need to know pre-calculus. I think you technically don't need to know trig either. So you're basically going to be using a lot of algebra, geometry, probability, but I would call the math section more like a puzzle or problem solving type of thing than a typical like SAT solve the problem type of thing, if that makes sense. But before you get started on anything, even before you take a practice test, I would definitely recommend that you go through the official ETS math review guide, because it just sets up the foundation and reminds you of all the stuff that you might not have seen in a while. Because I mean, for me, it was like basically since high school before I'd seen all that stuff again. But yeah, and then after you take the math review, maybe you can take your first practice test. But going back to the quant, again, I'd recommend strategies from GregMat. I think where GregMat really shines is his strategies for the quantitative section and how he thinks about the quantitative section. So I highly recommend him for that. There's also a common book out there called the Manhattan 5-Pound Book of GRE practice problems. It's a lot of practice problems, but if you need more help on the quant, I'd recommend going through the quant section from that book as well. And fun fact on the GRE, this is the calculator that you get. It basically looks exactly like that. So it's just a 4-function calculator. So everything that all the questions you should be able to solve using simple math or math that you can calculate with that calculator. So if you're taking the test and you find yourself like getting really complicated, just remember, if it's that complicated, you're probably doing something wrong. It's probably an easier way to solve the problem. And then paying attention to your timing and prioritizing is important for all tests, but I think for the GRE, it's especially important for the quantitative reasoning part. And so here are some really easy examples of what you might see. So there's something called the Quantitative Comparison section. I think this was the most new to me. On this section, all the answer choices that you see there will be the exact same for all questions of that type. So you get either A is greater, B is greater, both of them are equal, or you can't determine the relationship. And then the quantities, sometimes it's simple algebra like this. Sometimes it's like a probability thing. Sometimes there's even a geometry thing. So it just depends. And then for multiple choice, it's also sometimes multiple answers instead of one. So you guys can kind of see what types of problems that you might see on the GRE based on this. Yeah, I don't know, not much else to say about the math section on my part, but definitely I feel like the math is just a matter of practice. If you're not good at this stuff, I think anyone can get good at it if they just do enough practice for the GRE, because the GRE is not really like math. It's like, you know, a little more problem solving type of math. It's just getting used to the question styles that they ask you. So just quick summary of everything. Definitely set a deadline for yourself by actually paying and registering for the exam. I made this mistake and I have friends who made this mistake where like we just said that we were going to take it at this time, but because I never paid or set an actual date for myself, I ended up procrastinating a ton and like pushing it back. And you can actually reschedule it, but it will cost you money. So at least, you know, you have that like pressure on you to start studying. And definitely make sure, kind of like what we talked about earlier, make sure that you have enough time to study properly for it regularly. So every day at least. And then another tip that I'd recommend is just to go through those flashcard apps, or that flashcard app from Magoosh. Do a little bit every day because it really builds up. It's also really easy to take on the go. So if you're out and about and you just want to do like a couple vocab cards, all of that will help. And definitely focus on your weaknesses. So this is why I recommend taking a practice exam earlier on. Some people like to save both of the free ones until the end, but personally, I think that knowing what you need to work on more will help you a lot more and be more efficient with your study strategy. And also, when you are taking the test, answer every question, because the GRE does not penalize you for getting things wrong. So you could feel free to guess on everything. And then also later, I'll send out a document in the recap email with all of the resources that I spoke about today. And so that's basically it. Does anyone have any questions about anything that I talked about?